No introduction needed here. I'm fat, you're fat, we're all fat. Let's talk about fat, the different types, and how much of each you need to be eating. So before we do that, we gotta talk about a few things. Number one, what's fat really do? You may or may not know that it's actually very important to structures. So all of your cells, for the most part, have what's called a phospholipid, and lipid is pretty similar to fat, bilayer membrane, which means their cell walls that keep them together are made of fat. Of course, it's an energy producer, which is what we're going to talk about today in bulk. It's also required for a bunch of fat absorption, digestion, and transportation. So we call these fat-soluble vitamins. In other words, if you're going to take some supplemental vitamin D, it's probably important to do it when you eat fat, because we need fat to take the D and, like I said, transport it and move it around. So it's really important for a bunch of vitamin things. It's also the backbone of your hormone production. So in other videos, I'll talk about how you can use things like cholesterol to then make testosterone. And so if you are then extremely low on fat, you're probably going to have some hormonal dysregulation, or potentially. Skin, hair, things like that are also made from fat. Of course, it does temperature regulation, right? Everyone knows that. If you have a little bit of extra fat, especially around the adipose site, the underneath the skin, etc., you can handle colder temperatures a little bit better, and vice versa. And then it also does what I call quarantining, and I thought, based on the time I'm filming this in June 2020, so the terms quarantining felt nice here, but really what I mean is if you've got, say, toxins, and don't go too crazy with that word, but what fat can do is it can sequester them. So you can store these toxins, if you want, in the fat until you have proper time to digest them and urinate them out or get rid of them in some other fashion. Also a potential problem, because you may not realize they're still in you and then they could come leaking out later, but nonetheless. So I guess the point I wanted to make with all this is people tend to think about nutrition or fat in regard to how much do I eat, etc., but they don't really realize what else it's doing. And we've also, and that's because we've demonized fat a lot. The logic is clear. If I eat fat, I get fat. But hopefully, as I'll show you in a second, and all my numerous other videos that I have, that's not simply the case. Okay, so now the most basic way to think about fat is it's separated into either unsaturated or saturated. And we're going to go into these different categories, what they are, and explain how much you should be eating of each. And really, I'll show you the background of what they look like and then why they function the way they function. And I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler here. Unsaturated fat is not, quote unquote, bad for you. Any excess of fat, any excess of carbohydrate, any excess of food ingestion can lead to you getting over fat, and that's not great, right? So, but we don't need to necessarily go on low-fat diets. And so because of that, we actually probably should issue a bit of a formal apology to fat. I mean, I certainly know when I was in school, it was very much demonized. Don't eat fat, low-fat diets, etc. And if you're paying attention at all the last 10 years, that was clearly very wrong. Fat is not inherently extremely bad for you. Probably the reason it gets this bad rap is it does have over 2 times the amount of calories per gram that carbohydrates and protein do. So if you look at a giant plate of food and you see a big pile of chicken and you see an equal pile of avocado, the avocado is going to have twice the calories. So if you ever looked at the calories, say, in peanut butter, this is a classic example, and you're like, wow, a whole huge cup is not the 200 calorie serving size. It's actually really, really, really small. So because of that, people can accidentally eat more calories than they realize when they eat fat. When you eat more calories, you may get fat. Okay, but if if fat is eaten at a normal quantity or an appropriate quantity, they're not extremely dangerous for you. In fact, saturated fat has many, many benefits that we're going to talk about, and it should be a part of your diet. You don't want to walk around consuming no amount of saturated fat. But we do want to keep it in regulation, just like we want to keep everything in regulation. Okay, so I could talk at length about this topic, but I want to get into the real beef of today. But that is an important note we have to make anytime we talk about fat, is what we did wrong there. Having said that, just because fat isn't inherently bad for you, it's probably not a good idea to walk around and eat 15 pieces of bacon a day. There are some problems, and there are still some very clear poor health associations with excessive saturated fat, right? Now again, eating animal fat, eating saturated fat in its natural state is fine, But just like anything else, quantities should be measured, right? And 15 pieces of bacon a day is not a reasonable approach. You're going to get too much saturated fat. And I don't care what people that are ridiculous and huge ideologues and zealots of ketosis will tell you. If you eat too much fat, you will get fat, period. There's no discussion there. Right? Now, it's not nearly as bad as we thought it was, but that doesn't mean it's a free pass either. I have a lot more thoughts on that topic, of course, but like I said, I want to move on to the beef of what we're getting into today. So the basic way that we store fat in our body, whether it's visceral or subcutaneous, so visceral being kind of around your core, if you will, maybe packed around your liver, etc., and subcutaneous being underneath your skin. Okay, we call that all kind of adipose tissue. Those are typically stored as what we call triglyceride. Tri meaning 3, and glyceride. So you can see here these circles, and each circle is a carbon atom. So just like carbohydrates, triglycerides are made primarily of long chains of carbon. And this is why we term things like organic chemistry basically the study of carbon. All life really comes down to that. And so here's what happens. Triglycerides form a fancy E structure. Okay, so it has those 3 red circles, which are what we call the glycerol backbone. So that's actually a 3 carbon carbohydrate called glycerol. And then each one of these chains coming horizontally off each carbon from the glycerol backbone is a fatty acid chain. Okay, so when you put those 3 fatty acid chains together on the backbone of the glycerol, we get a triglyceride. And that's how we store them in our body. Plants do the same thing. Other animals store it the same way. When we go to metabolize this fat for energy or for fuel, we have to break that down. The glycerol goes into its own piece, and in fact, the glycerol can be converted into glucose, if you'd like. And then we can actually start chopping these fatty acid chains down a couple of carbons at a time. That's called beta oxidation. I've got separate videos going through all this in detail if you want to look around. But nonetheless, these fatty acids are broken down a couple of carbons at a time. That energy is released, and we get that. And this is why, for example, if you compare this to carbohydrates, which typically have 6 carbons total, and a triglyceride, as you're clearly seeing, has far more than 6, you can get way more energy per gram of fat than you can per gram of carbohydrate. Again, it's over twice as much. 9 grams or kcals per gram versus about 4 for carbohydrate. Now, the fatty acid chains themselves don't typically get stored as carbohydrate, so you can't really do that. But again, the glycerol backbone, at least we think, the glycerol backbone definitely can. If you break down a triglyceride, put it in the bloodstream, don't end up using it, instead of being converted to carbohydrate, it'll probably just get what's called re-esterified and restored back as an adipose tissue. Okay, and so this is just a visual of what's happening there. Again, I put a number in each one, and so in this particular case, there are 12 carbons per fatty acid chain. Now, as you'll see in a second, the number actually can be quite dramatically different. So fatty acid chains are typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 22 carbons long, but they can certainly be as low as 6 and far higher than 6. In human nutrition, though, that's mostly what we're talking about, is 12 to 22 carbon in length of the fatty acid chains. Now, within a triglyceride, not all fatty acid chains have to be equal. So in this example, they're all 3 12 carbon lengths, but it could be 12 and then a 10 and an 8 or something like that. Okay. Now, the length of each carbon in a fatty acid chain is what determines what type of fatty acid we call it. And I'll show you examples in a second. And I know you've heard of some of them and you may not realize, oh, that's what that term means. Okay, so another way to think about it is this. We typically classify the fatty acid chains as short, medium, long, and very long. And you can see the numbers that would denote those qualifications or those quantifications here. But like I said, the medium to long chain fatty acids are by far the most abundant in both plant and animal sources. And so for human nutrition, that's really what we're talking about. Now, some other videos I've made, there's actually a long one called, I think, Why You Fart So Much, or something like that. You can see actually where short chain fatty acids come from. It's actually can be a result of carbohydrate digestion. Yeah, that's right. The special bacteria in your large intestines can actually metabolize special types of carbohydrates, and as a byproduct of that, give out short chain fatty acids. Okay, you may also, if you're into ketosis and want to look more at that stuff, you'll start to see short chain, medium chain fatty acid stuff being important for those types of eatings. And then there are, again, the very long chain fatty acids as well, which are more than the 22 line, but the medium and long chain. If you also watch some of the metabolism and performance-based videos I have, and I've probably covered this in at least 3 to 5 videos, you can see the functional and important differences between, say, the short and medium chain fatty acids and the long and very long in terms of how we metabolize them for energy, how some can be very effective for performance, some are less effective, and how that all rolls up. Also explains things like putting large chunks of coconut butter or other super fatty things in your coffee, why all that stuff happens. And I'll give you a spoiler, the short and medium chains get to do a special trick through the brain and the mitochondria that the long chains don't get to. So anyways, point is, important functional differences between them. So let's go back to the beginning here and let's talk a little bit more about saturated specifically, and then we'll go into unsaturated, and I'll finish here with some examples of how much to eat. So the way that you can typically tell that a fat is saturated is whether or not it's solid at room temperature. So if you think of things like butter, coconut oil, meat, these are all going to be solid. They're not liquid form. And here again, you can see on this slide some of the different examples of the different types of butter, butyric acid, lauric acid, palmitic acid, stearic acid. Those are all very, very common that you would see. If you want to memorize these things, that's fine, but I'm just trying to highlight the fact that when the length of the carbons are different in a chain, we call it something different. And all of those examples, with the exception of milk, but it's not hard to see cheese and yogurt and things like that, are solid at room temperature. Okay? If we contrast that to the image I showed you before, this is actually what the triglycerides look like. So you can see the blue part over there, the vertical blue. And what you're actually seeing are those 3 carbon chains like I talked about. And because of chemistry reasons, the carbons have to have a hydrogen, which is what that H is, at the end. Okay, so you have the 3 carbon backbone, glycerol backbone, and then you have the different lengths of carbons coming out horizontally. The top one there you can see is saturated, and it's palmitic acid, so it's got its 15 carbons there. The next one down, stearic acid, has 17, and it's also saturated. But take a look at the third one. This is oleic acid, and it's what we call monounsaturated. Still has 17 carbons like stearic acid, but look at what happens with that funky corner. Okay? So that funky corner is important, and it is the reason why it's called monounsaturated. But before we get there real quick, I sort of forgot with palmitic acid. I wanted to give a couple of examples, but that, palmitic acid is very, very common, probably the most common fatty acid in humans. Stearic acid you're going to mostly get from animals and coconuts, etc. And the oleic acid is olive oil. In fact, I think depending on the olive oil, somewhere between 50 and 80% of olive oil is actually made up of oleic acid. Right? So it's very, very, very high in unsaturated fat. Okay, so now going back to here. Now the chemistry here is very important because it determines both the name and the function. And I know you probably have been thinking, hey, look, we've been told the saturated fats are worse for us and the unsaturated fats are better. And most people on the street would say that. And it's not totally wrong. The question is why? And that's what we're going to answer. So you can see that it bends in there. And the reason it's doing that is because it's got a double carbon bond. So look at where that arrow is pointing. You see how the carbon chain in that bend has 2 horizontal arrows connecting it. Looks like an equal sign. Well, in chemistry, organic chemistry, that signifies a double bond. And the reason it's double bonded is because it's missing 2 hydrogens. You see below? See how all the other carbons have a hydrogen above it and below it. But these 2 lack a hydrogen below it. And so because atoms like to be bonded, and you know, you remember this from middle or high school or something, they don't like to be unbalanced. Think of it this way, the things that hang out from the bottom of the carbons say there's nothing here, and so we'll just go sideways and link up so we're all at least balanced. What this does is cause a bend in the chain. It also works exactly like dominoes in terms of, if you've ever played that game, you can't play on pieces that are covered up on all sides, right? Metabolism is almost the exact same way. So because the fact that it is not covered up right there, you can actually very easily get in and start metabolizing the fatty acid right there. It's an opening. And so now the differences between unsaturated and saturated fat chemically have functional significance and health ones because of the pros and cons. So for example, because unsaturated fats have this opening, if you will, that make them easier to metabolize, they're typically not stored as well. Saturated fats store far better. Unsaturated ones store worse. They're easier to metabolize. They're easier to burn for energy. And so because of that, they're less likely to make us over fat. Now, as long as they're the same calories, right? Or less calories. But the downside is with unsaturated fats, in this case it's monounsaturated, that also means they go rancid faster. And so if you're looking at this from the entire, I'll say, eating circle, if you're the manufacturer, you don't want to make products that go rancid really fast because you're going to lose your stuff. It doesn't have the shelf life. In fact, people don't want it, right? It's going to go bad. And this is why things like olive oil are far more expensive than things like butter, because or even coconut oil is more expensive than olive oil, because they have to account for the fact that it's going to be stable or not stable. They're going to lose a lot of their products. They have to ship it colder. They have to make sure the bottle is not be able to be penetrated by light, etc. So it's good for you, but it's more expensive. So there are pros and cons. Inside your body, it's the same thing. There are cons to having good storage, ability to store backup energy. This is one of the major benefits of having, again, stored fat. Having fat on you is not necessarily a bad thing. We just don't want to be over fat. Okay? So to kind of recap what I just said, a saturated fat means it has zero double carbon bonds in any of its fatty acids. So going back here, all those carbons have one bond. They don't have that equal sign. Unsaturated, though, have at least one double carbon bond in at least one of its fatty acids. Now, you can continue that down and say also what this really means is a saturated fat is not missing any or is missing 0 hydrogens. An unsaturated fat is missing 2 or more. Okay? So unsaturated fats are unstable, in other words, easy to metabolize but go rancid fat. Where saturated fats are stable, they store well. But why was that again? I'm quizzing you. Why were the saturated fats better at being stored? That's right, because they're not missing that hydrogen bond. So they're harder to metabolize. Oxygen has a more difficult time. If you remember from some of the other videos, fat metabolism is 100% aerobic. There's no anaerobic component to it, so it requires oxygen. By the same token, if you put fat in an environment that has access to oxygen, like leaving your olive oil open, it will start to metabolize and go rancid really, really, really quickly. The same is true for things like walnuts or other, even whole foods that are high in unsaturated fat. They go rancid really quick, so you got to keep them in cool, dark places. Don't expose them to air, don't expose them to light. They go bad fast. But things like your margarine, you can leave out on the table, and it might melt, but it's probably not going to go rancid that fast. You got a long time. Cheese, the same way. Bacon, you get it, right? Okay, so now these unsaturated fats can be in the form of what are called monounsaturated or polyunsaturated. So in the oleic acid example, the olive oil one I showed you, it had one spot that had a double carbon bond there. If it has more than that, so if there was a break and then another break somewhere, then we would call it a polyunsaturated fat. Okay? There are other types of unsaturated fat called trans fats, and I know you're thinking trans fats, those are the ones that are bad for me. Yes, but they're unsaturated, and that confuses a lot of people. Here's exactly what happens. So if we go back to our slide here. So remember our monounsaturated fat. The problem really was it's got that double carbon bond because it's missing 2 hydrogens. So if I come in and I hydrogenate or add hydrogens back to that, I have taken an unsaturated fat and made it a saturated fat. Okay? We call that process hydrogenating. And so in the case of things like oil from soybeans, we may call this a partially hydrogenated soybean oil. This is exactly what happens with trans fats. And so why they're so bad is because you're taking a naturally mono or polyunsaturated fatty acid and unnaturally forcing it into becoming a saturated fat. So something that's supposed to have the properties of unsaturated or poly now have the properties of saturated. and it causes a whole litany of problems. Now, you are in a good spot because you generally don't have to worry about that because trans fats are no longer really legal. Now, they're going around them, but trans fats, for the most part, are one type of fat that almost no one disagrees with anymore in terms of it being healthy. Right? It is basically unequivocally bad. No one argues that anymore. So that's slide at the end of the touch. That is exactly what happens with things like margarine. So if you look at margarine, that's something that I grew up on, and my generation probably ate more margarine than they did butter because it was cheaper and it's stored longer, right? So what they did is they took the little bit of unsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fats and mono in butter and they hydrogenated it, or they made butter from non-butter things. In this particular example, many margarines only contain 5 to 20% actual butter. The rest of it was other things. And so it was a butter substitute. We thought it was better because it had quote unquote less fat, but it actually just had a boatload of trans fat and it was terrible for us. And so margarine, if you go to the stores now, it's very hard to find, right? Compared to regular butters, whole fat or otherwise, right? But that's in case you're wondering what partially hydrogenated soybean oils actually are. And then to finish up here, our last category of unsaturated fats are what we call the omega fatty acids. So omega-3, 6, and 9. These are what people typically call fish oil. I'm going to make a separate video, probably 25 minutes or so, on fish oil specifically, and I'll go into everything there like I kind of just did, how much, how it works, what it really basically is, etc. But the omega-3 and the omega-6s are what some people will call the essential fatty acids. And so these are ones that we need to kind of make sure we consume in our diet. If you go watch one of the protein videos, you'll see that there are some amino acids that are also essential, but this is really the only fat version of the essential ones we need to get in our diet. So to finish up on some practical recommendations here, how much fat to eat. Typically somewhere in the neighborhood of, I'll even slide this down, 20 to 35% of our total calories, but remember that actually means probably half the volume of food on our plate. I made a separate video where I showed you different food examples. Okay, I can't remember the exact title. It says carbs, fats, proteins, what are they really, or something like that. But because the caloric amount per size is so much bigger, the total volume needs to be smaller, right? So now that number can vary. Of course, if you're doing a specific high-fat diet or something like that, of course it can go up. Of course you can survive just fine on 60, 70, 80% fat. Of course you can. I'm just saying for most people normally who are not on a specific ketogenic diet, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 35% of your calories from fat is a very reasonable number. In terms of saturated fat, probably about a third of your fat being saturated is okay. Again, you can go a little higher, but if you translate the math there, that means in the neighborhood of 10% of your total calories coming from saturated fat. And I'll actually say this inverse. You don't really want to be lower than that. You're probably going to run into some hormonal problems if you start getting a lot lower than that and everything else is not in check. You're going to have problems potentially absorbing some of these vitamins and some other things. So I wouldn't make sure that you're minimizing saturated fat to like a 0. Just eat real whole foods and the fat will probably be just fine. In terms of cholesterol, guys, remember that's a fat as well. Less than around 300 milligrams per day, especially if you're not very active. If you are, that can go a little bit higher. But we don't need to go out of our way to eat a tremendous amount of cholesterol. Now, of course, eating cholesterol doesn't necessarily mean cholesterol in your arteries and stuff, but there is clearly a relationship there. Okay, it's not what we were once told, but that doesn't mean there's no relationship at all either. In terms of the omega-3s, some in the neighborhood of 1.5 grams per day, depending on which species you are, male or female. And it just depends on what you're aiming for here. So if you're looking for like the cardiovascular benefits, etc. Now, people are not as hot on fish oil supplementation as we used to be. Watch this fish oil video for that. But if you're looking for the anti-inflammatory benefits of them, the numbers can be a little bit higher. So I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 or so grams per day to maybe a little bit higher is still totally fine depending on what you're going after. Health, training, high volume, low volume, recovery, peak performance, etc. But then you can adjust with goal. So fat is a pretty easy one to adjust with your goal. So if you're trying to lose weight, you cut a little bit of fat out and the calories really come off. It's very easy. You don't have to cut the food down nearly as much. Likewise, if you want to go up. So a very quick way, if you're like, man, I'm under calories because I'm training really hard, or I'm trying to add muscle, or I have a hard time eating, just double up the spoonfuls of almond butter and you'll get 300, 400, 500 extra calories really, really quickly. Put a little bit of extra oil on your food, on your salad. Like this comes real fast, real easy. So it's a very easy one to adjust with your goals. Hopefully that helped. Let me know in the comments, etc. What else under the fat umbrella do you want me to talk about? What do you want me to clarify? You want me to do another short video, longer one? What do you want me to go into? Share it around, learn from that, and some of you, I'll see you in class, or pseudo see you in class, or see your quiz at least on this or something. The rest of you, I'll never see you ever probably, and it breaks my heart. Peace out, everyone.